All right, let's go. Number 10. The town that was repaired before it died. In 1967, the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos put a trench into a dry ravine on the south coast of Santorini. He was looking for a buried Bronze Age settlement. He found one within days. The ash came away from a wall, and behind the wall was a second story, and behind that, a street. The town under the pumice is called Akrotiri, after the modern village on the ridge above it. Its real name is lost to us. Akrotiri was a port, and a wealthy one. Its people lived in stone houses 2 and 3 stories high, with drains and toilets plumbed into the walls. They painted those walls with antelopes boxing children and blue monkeys. Then somewhere in the 16th century before Christ, the island that fed all of this tore itself open and buried the town under more than 5 meters of pumice and ash. That is the disaster everyone knows about. It is not the one that shaped the site. Before the volcano, there was an earthquake. It brought down parts of multi-story buildings, tore frescoes off their walls, and cracked load-bearing masonry across the town. What the excavators found in the streets afterwards was not collapse lying where it fell. It was rubble that had been gathered, carried, and heaped into piles along the main roads. Someone had cleared it. Large stone balls lay among the wreckage, heavy enough to work as wrecking weights for pulling down walls that were no longer safe to leave standing. So the people came back. They came back with demolition gangs and building materials, and they started putting Akrotiri together again. Most of the damaged houses show salvage work of some kind. In one upstairs room of the building, excavators call the West House, they found 2 vessels holding dried plaster, and a third holding dried paint set down on the floor and never picked up. The truly unsettling detail is how ordinary the interruption looks. A repair job paused, then the ground opened. The eruption came in stages, and the sequence is readable in the deposit. First, a thin dusting of ash, a few centimeters with almost no weathering on top of it, which means the gap before the next stage was short. Then, the pumice falling in a hot rain that filled the streets and the stairwells and the light wells. Then, the surge's superheated clouds of gas and rock moving fast enough to strip away anything still standing above the fill. Then, the caldera collapsed and the sea came in. No one has ever recovered a body from Akrotiri. Not one. For a town of this size, buried this quickly, that absence is extraordinary. The likeliest reading is that the earthquake had already emptied the place of its dead and most of its living, and that the short warning was enough to move the rest onto boats. Christos Dumas, who has directed the excavation since 1975, thinks the earthquake dead lie in a cemetery west of the town that nobody has yet located. We cannot even fix the year. Radiocarbon dating and Gean pottery chronology have disagreed for 4 decades. And the argument has narrowed to the 16th century BC without ever closing. A sulfur spike in the polar ice that was once treated as Thera's calling card has since been reassigned to a volcano in Alaska. This is one of the most intensively studied events in prehistory, and we still cannot give it a date. What survives is the repair. Plaster poured into the voids left by rotted wood has given back beds a table, a stool, standing where they stood, and under more than 5 meters of rock, in an upstairs room of the West House. 3 small vessels of plaster and paint dried out, waiting for a workman who never came back up the stairs. Number 9. The mound that held 9 cities. Hisarlik is a low hill in northwestern Turkey, a few kilometers inland from the Aegean. Around 20 meters of it is not hill. It is refuse. Collapsed mud brick ash, smashed pottery, and floors laid directly on the wreckage of older floors piled up across roughly 3,000 years of occupation. Excavators count 9 main cities in that stack, Troy 1 through Troy 9. Carl Blagan subdivided them into 46 separate strata, and Manfred Korfmann later counted 22 building levels inside Troy 1 and 2 alone. Nobody planned that mound. It is what happens when a place is destroyed often enough and rebuilt almost every time. The second city ended in fire, around 2300 BC. Heinrich Schliemann digging from 1870 on ground that Frank Calvert, a local landowner and consular official, had identified and half-owned, called it the Burnt City. It is where he found the gold he insisted on calling Priam's treasure. That name has not aged well. The material is roughly 1,000 years too early for any Homeric siege. Schliemann's account of the find spot is demonstrably false, and specialists now think the hoard is a composite assembled from several separate finds. The fire, though, is real. So is what happened next. The survivors stayed. Troy III was built directly on the ruins of Troy II, in places reusing its walls. It was poorer and smaller than what it replaced, and it went up immediately. Not every recovery was that quick. New radiocarbon dates confirm one real break in the sequence, a gap of roughly a century after Troy III. But here is where the mound stops being a ruin and starts being a record. Troy the Ksei, the Great Walled City of the Late Bronze Age, came down around 1300 BC. Blegen found extensive collapsed masonry and subsidence in the southeast corner of the citadel, and crucially, he found no burning and no bodies in the debris. He concluded that an earthquake had done it. Most specialists still agree, but the evidence is an inference from tilted stone, and revolt and attack have both been proposed instead. Whatever knocked it down, the people who cleared up afterwards were the same people. The pottery does not change. The building traditions do not change. Troy Vithya is Troy VI, rebuilt by survivors and their children inside walls their grandparents had raised. What makes that rebuilding so telling is what they did with the ground. They renovated the old citadel wall and added stone towers and mud brick breastworks. They packed small houses into open areas inside the fortifications, sharing party walls fitting far more people into the same defended space. And they cut pits into the floors of those houses and sank enormous storage jars into them up to the rim, so the food was underground and out of sight. That is not a shantytown, whatever older documentaries say. The houses are sturdily built. It is a city that had learned something and was preparing for something. It burned around 1180 BC. Excavators found scorch marks, charred timbers, arrowheads, heaps of sling stones, and unburied human bones lying in the streets. That last detail is the signature of a defeat brutal enough that nobody was left to bury the dead. Troy was rebuilt again and again, thinning into an Iron Age shadow before Greek settlers arrived around 700 BC. Almost nothing was ever written down there. A century of digging has produced one piece of Bronze Age, writing a small bronze seal carrying Luwian hieroglyphs found in 1995. Everything we can read about the place comes from elsewhere, from Hittite archives far inland that mention a kingdom called Wilusa. The haunting thing about Hisarlik is that the name Troy does not really belong to a city. It belongs to a habit. 9 cities are in that hill, because 9 times people looked at the ruin under their feet and decided it was worth living on. And the city everyone actually means, the one with the towers and the buried grain jars and the bones in the street, was built by refugees from the disaster before it. Number 8. Tanagashima. Roughly 7,300 years ago, the seafloor south of Kyushu tore open. The Kikai caldera is a submarine collapse structure about 19 kilometers across, and what came out of it that day is the largest eruption known from the Holocene, the entire warm period in which every human civilization has existed. We know the size of it because of a survey published in 2024. A team from Kobe University took a research vessel out over the caldera and ran seismic reflection profiles at 3-meter vertical resolution, then cored the sediments to check what the profiles were showing. The submarine deposits alone came out at between 133 and 183 cubic kilometers of dense rock, spread across more than 4,500 square kilometers of seafloor. Estimates for the whole eruption run from 300 cubic kilometers to over 500. The pyroclastic flow then did something that sounds impossible. It crossed some 50 kilometers of open ocean and came ashore in southern Kyushu, still hot enough to kill everything it touched, running out to 100 kilometers and more from the vent. The survey found that the submarine flows had traveled uphill along the seafloor. A cloud of superheated rock that treats 50 kilometers of open sea as an inconvenience is a terrifying thing to have to model. Then came the ash. The Akahoya tephra fell across something like 2 million square kilometers of Northeast Asia, reaching Honshu, southern Korea, and Okinawa. And on Tanagashima, an island about 40 kilometers off the southern tip of Kyushu. It settled into a compacted layer up to a meter thick. There were people on that island. The Jomon of southern Kyushu were among the most settled hunter-gatherers anywhere on Earth, living in pit houses, making pottery thousands of years older than anything in the Near East, processing deer and boar in tunnel-shaped smoking pits. Their pottery styles are precise enough that archaeologists can date a layer from the rim of a broken pot. And then for several centuries, nothing. This is where a long-standing assumption had to be dismantled. For decades, the story was that the Akahoya ash extinguished all human life across Kyushu and caused a clean cultural break. A study published in the journal Antiquity in 2023 by Junzo Uchiyama and colleagues took that apart. On the mainland of southern Kyushu, the Todoroki pottery tradition runs straight through the eruption, and a survivor phase, called Nishinosono, appears within about 50 years of the ashfall. People were still there, battered and displaced, but there, Tanagashima is different. The survivor pottery is completely absent from the island. The occupation record simply stops and stays stopped for something on the order of 200 to 400 years. The island sat inside what the researchers call the dead zone, the belt of coast and offshore land where the flows and the deep ash left nothing to come back to. What ended the silence was not survival. It was recolonization. Around 7,100 to 6,900 years ago, a pottery style called Todoroki B1 shows up at the Tosa site on Tanagashima. It is a mainland style. The people who repopulated the island were descendants of groups that had lived through the eruption outside the dead zone. Nobody alive had seen the place. They were resettling a landscape that existed only as a story. Kikai has not finished. The caldera is still active, with regular explosive activity at Iyotaki on its northwestern rim and a standing alert level. In 2018, a survey found a rhyolite lava dome sitting on the caldera floor, about 10 kilometers across, 600 meters high, roughly 32 cubic kilometers of magma, with gas bubbling out of its surface. Its chemistry places it with the post-caldera products, the family the cones erupting today belong to, which means the system underneath is not extinct. It is charging. On Tanagashima, the eruption is a line in the ground. Below it, pit houses, hearths, fish bones, and pots. Above it, a meter of white ash. Above that, after a gap long enough that no living memory could have crossed it someone else's pottery, the island came back. The people who had lived there did not, and nothing in the record tells us where the last of them went. Number 7. The sling bullets of Hamoukar. They are the size of a large olive, oval hand-rolled from clay about 3.5 centimeters long, weighing around 25 grams each. In the 2005 season alone, excavators at Tel Hamoukar in northeastern Syria recovered roughly 1,200 of them. Across 2005 and 2006, the count passed 2,300. Alongside them lay more than 130 larger clay balls, 6 to 10 centimeters across, some weighing half a kilo. About 200 of the smaller bullets are deformed. They hit something hard enough to flatten one end into a blunt cone. One of them was still stuck in the wall plaster where it landed. They are also standardized. The bullets cluster tightly around the same length and the same weight, which means they were not scooped up in a panic. Somebody was manufacturing ammunition to a specification in quantity before there was anything to shoot at. The dig was a joint Syrian and American expedition run by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago with the Syrian Antiquities Service. McGuire Gibson opened the site in 1999. Clemens Reichel and Salem Al-Kuntar directed the seasons that found the battle. What they uncovered was a late Chalcolithic town of perhaps 13 to 16 hectares, destroyed around 3,500 BC, with mud brick walls collapsed and burned and preserved to an unprecedented height of nearly 2 meters, and with buildings that had gone down still holding their contents. A defensive wall about 3 meters high had not been enough. One find is hard to shake off. Among the debris was a shallow pit holding sling bullets in the middle of being made. Someone was still rolling ammunition out of wet clay when the wall came down. This was not a marginal place. South of the main mound, a scatter of obsidian cores and production debris runs across nearly 300 hectares, dating to centuries before the destruction. The nearest sources of that volcanic glass are in Turkey, over 150 kilometers north. Hamoukar was not just using obsidian. It was manufacturing with it at scale long before anyone in the region had writing. The problem is that nobody can say for certain who fired the bullets. Directly above the burned buildings and filling the pits cut into the destruction debris, the pottery is almost exclusively southern Mesopotamian Uruk ware. Reichel's own reading is careful and blunt at the same time. The Uruk people either fired those bullets or certainly benefited from it, and they took the place over immediately afterwards. But pottery lying on top of a burned layer proves association, not causation. What we can say is that the town was taken by force. Who took it is a separate question. What makes the aftermath so disturbing is how fast normal life resumes. The excavation report describes cleanup work after the fire and an occupation by squatters most likely, survivors of the attack living in the shell of their own town. 12 graves were cut into the debris. They may hold the war dead. They may equally hold people who starved or fell ill in the months that followed, which is its own kind of horrifying arithmetic. 2 more bodies turned up in 2008, apparently never buried at all. Hamoukar was not abandoned. It went on, being lived in for another 1,000 years. And by around 2200 BC, it covered roughly 100 hectares, with a lower city spreading round the mound. It was finally given up at the end of the 3rd millennium. One correction is worth making because the press coverage in 2005 overreached. Hamoukar is often called the earliest evidence of organized urban warfare. It is not quite a late Chalcolithic mass graves at Tel Brak, some 85 kilometers west, are 2 to 3 centuries older and hold several hundred people with a mortality profile that looks like combat, which is the genuinely brutal part of the story. The oldest cities in the world are only a few centuries older than the oldest evidence of cities destroying each other. Organized violence arrives with urban life not long after it, and the response at Hamoukar was not to leave. It was to sweep out the ash patch, the walls, and stay for another 1,000 years on top of the burned layer. Number 6. The second palace at Knossos. The palace tourists walk through on Crete is not the first one. It is the replacement. The first palace at Knossos went up soon after 1900, BCA monumental complex covering something like 14,000 square meters. It was organized around a central court, with workshop staircases running down the hillside and long ranks of storage magazines along the west side. Those magazines say what the place was for. Rows of jars taller than a person and stone-lined pits sunk into the floors, holding oil and grain far past anything a household could eat. Somebody was gathering the produce of a whole landscape into one building. It stood for roughly 2 centuries. Around 1700 BC, it came down at the end of the Middle Minoan II period in an event usually attributed to an earthquake or a run of them. The attribution is probable rather than proven. But Crete sits in one of the most seismically active corners of the Mediterranean, and the damage pattern fits. What happened next is the interesting part, and it is not what the phrase rebuilt from the ruins usually implies. The Minoans did not clear the site. On the east side, damaged basement rooms were packed with rubble and turned into terraces for the new construction to stand on. In the west court, 3 large circular pits, known as the couloirs, whose purpose is still argued about, were filled in, and the court was extended out over the top of them. The old palace was not demolished. It was buried in place and used as foundation. Except this was not a one-off. Knossos was patched, extended, and rebuilt repeatedly across the next 2.5 centuries, and parts of it certainly came down in earthquakes more than once. What emerged from all of that is the building in every photograph. Bigger, more elaborate, with light wells and gypsum floors and the frescoes that made Minoan Crete famous. It is a rebuild standing on a rebuild. That ordering matters more than it sounds. Everything the word Minoan conjures the bull leaping. The octopus jars, the sea trade reaching Egypt, belongs to the palace that went up after the first one failed. The extraordinary phase of the civilization is the recovery phase. Around 1450 BC, the palace was badly damaged again during a wider collapse that hit sites right across Crete. Knossos survived it. It carried on as an administrative center, but the tablets in the archive changed language. Linear A, the Minoan script, disappears. Linear B appears in its place, and Linear B is an early form of Greek. Somebody else was running the building. Around 1350 BC, it burned for the last time, and this time, nobody rebuilt. That leaves a hole in the evidence nobody has been able to close. The Minoans kept written records for something like 600 years through every one of these disasters. First in Cretan hieroglyphic, and then in Linear A, and we cannot read a word of either. Everything we say about why they rebuilt and what the palace was actually for, we have reconstructed from architecture, pottery, and pictures. Was the second palace a statement of power, or simply what people do when the roof falls in? We have no way to ask. That is the haunting part, because the people who rebuilt it were keeping records the whole time. There is one more layer on that hill, and it is a modern one. Arthur Evans began excavating in 1900 and spent the next 30 years there. His architect, Christian Dahl, rebuilt the grand staircase in 1904 and 1905, using steel joists and vaulted brick ceilings to hold up a structure that dropped more than 7 meters below the central court and had already partly collapsed. From the 1920s onward, working with his architect Piet de Jong, Evans went further and reconstructed whole sections in reinforced concrete, with frescoes repainted by Émile Gilliéron and his son to suggest what Evans believed had stood there. The red columns are his. So are the upper floors. So, one of the most photographed prehistoric ruins in Europe is a concrete reconstruction of a Bronze Age rebuild that was raised on the packed rubble of an older palace, which is still down there under the floors. 3 versions of the same building are stacked on that hill. Only one of them was ever finished, and it is not the one in the photographs. Number 5. The valley that was buried twice. In 1976, a bulldozer driver in central El Salvador was flattening a low rise to make a pad for government grain silos. His blade cut the corner off a building that had no business being there. It turned out to be a Maya farmhouse intact, standing under 5 to 7 meters of volcanic ash. Payson Sheets of the University of Colorado has worked the site called Joya de Cerén on and off ever since. It is the best preserved ordinary village in the Americas, and it became a World Heritage Site in 1993. The preservation comes down to how the ash arrived. Roughly 14 separate tephra units laid down over a matter of days from a vent called Loma Caldera 600 meters north. Radiocarbon puts the eruption in the early to middle 7th century, most probably somewhere between about 620 and 660 of the Common Era. The village was buried in the evening. Hearth fires had burned down to embers. Sleeping mats were rolled and not yet in use. Meals had been eaten and the dishes left out. Tools lay where people had put them down, and most of the community seems to have been gathered in one building. From the state of the crops in the fields, the month was probably August. The detail of what survived is frightening in its ordinariness. Thatch roofs, woven mats, painted gourds, a planted field of manioc with the ridges still standing, held in the ash exactly as the farmers had left it at the end of the working day. No human remains have ever been recovered. That suggests everybody got out. Be careful with it, though. Only a fraction of the village has been dug, and no bodies is not proof of escape. Sheets has suggested a precursor earthquake gave people a few minutes of warning. That is a hypothesis, not a finding. But here is where the valley story turns. Cerén was not an old village that had always been there. It was built on top of an earlier catastrophe. Underneath the site, and underneath the whole Zapotitan Valley, lies a layer of white volcanic ash called Tierra Blanca Joven. It came out of the Ilopango caldera about 30 kilometers away, and it was in a different class altogether. Near the vent, the deposits run from 3 meters to more than 60. Tens of centimeters of ash fell across roughly 20,000 square kilometers. Around half a meter settled on the floor of the Zapotitan Valley. Estimates for the magma erupted run from about 43 to 55 cubic kilometers. When it happened is one of the sharpest disputes in the field. A 2019 study wiggle-matched radiocarbon from buried tree trunks and landed on 539, or 540 of the Common Era, tying Ilopango to the global cooling that darkens skies, from Constantinople to China. A 2020 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences matched volcanic glass shards in Greenland ice to Ilopango, and dated it to 431, give or take 2 years. Both cannot be right. Radiocarbon cannot break the tie because the dates fall on a flat stretch of the calibration curve between 420 and 540. So we do not know which century emptied the valley. It matters less than what people did next. What people did next is not in dispute, and it is extraordinary. Excavations at San Andrés, the ceremonial center, a few kilometers from Cerén, show monumental construction, restarting within 5 to 30 years of the eruption, and 80 at the outside. Not a century of emptiness. A generation perhaps too. Better than that, they built the new temple out of the disaster. One construction phase at San Andrés used 5 meters of redeposited Tierra Blanca Joven tephra as fill, faced with cut stone blocks. The villagers at Cerén did the same thing on a smaller scale, quarrying weathered ash to raise the causeway that ran out to their fields. The Ilopango caldera is a lake, now 11 kilometers at its widest, a short drive from the capital of El Salvador. The ash it threw across the valley weathered into some of the most fertile soil in Central America, which is why people came back, and why a metropolitan area of nearly 2 million sits on its doorstep today. The material that killed the valley is the reason it is farmed. Cerén was a village of settlers living on the ash of the last eruption when the next one found them. Number 4. The temple sealed inside a temple. The north coast of Peru is one of the driest places on the planet. In an ordinary year, the Moche Valley gets almost no rain at all. That is why the Moche people could build a state out of mud. Between roughly the 1st and the 9th centuries of the Common Era, they raised 2 enormous adobe structures at the foot of Cerro Blanco. The larger one, Huaca del Sol, took more than 143 million mud bricks. It is the biggest brick building ever raised in South America. Its bricks carry 93 distinct maker's marks, and the mound was built in unbonded vertical segments as though separate work gangs each raised their own column and signed it. In the 17th century, Spanish treasure hunters diverted the river into its flank and washed at least 2/3 of it away. The smaller structure is the one that matters here. Since 1991, a project led by Santiago Uceda and Ricardo Morales of the National University of Trujillo has been taking Huaca de la Luna apart. Uceda worked on it until his death in 2018. What the project found inside is not one temple. It is at least 5, conventionally counted as 6, each built directly over the last across about 600 years. The Moche did not renovate. When a temple's time was up, they filled its rooms, sealed its painted facades intact behind fresh adobe, and raised a larger platform on top. Excavators now walk down through the layers into painted courtyards nobody had seen since the day they were entombed. The colors are still on the walls. The truly disturbing part is what lies between the floors. Uchida and Kanziani documented 3 separate sediment layers inside the Huaca, each containing fragments of painted wall that had been washed off and redeposited. Each layer sits under the floor of the next temple. The most recent dates to around the year 600. Something was driving water through a building in a desert hard enough to strip paint off the walls. Each time it happened, the Moche buried the damage and built higher. That something has a name. Every few years, the Pacific off Peru warms, the trade winds falter, and the driest coast in the world floods. Ice cores from the Quelcaya Cap in the southern Andes preserve annual precipitation for 1,500 years. They record a 3-decade drought between 562 and 594, about 30% below the mean, the harshest in the record. And then the rain came back. In 1995 and 1996, Steve Bourget excavated an enclosure at the Huaca called Plaza 3A. He found around 70 people, deposited in at least 5 separate episodes, embedded in layers of mud. The skeletons carry cut marks across the neck, vertebrae fractures from clubs and star-headed maces, and evidence of dismemberment. The alternating mud layers point to at least 2 heavy rainfall events. The reading most archaeologists accept is that these were captives killed during or immediately after the floods in the plaza in the rain. Isotopes in their teeth have been read as showing that the later victims came from valleys, progressively further away. Other analyses of the same bones argue they were local moche. What is not in dispute is that the killing was brutal, organized, and repeated. Here the evidence has to be handled honestly. The bones would not yield a radiocarbon date because the collagen had not survived. What we can actually measure is the mud and the order the layers lie in. The tie between these particular bodies and any particular flood is inference, not measurement. Izumi Shimada and his colleagues, who first proposed the drought, warned in print that their own dating was accurate only to within about 20 years. And that imprecision might allow an unwarranted correlation. In 2012, Jeffrey Quilter and Michelle Coons questioned whether a unified moche state ever existed to be brought down at all. A new center at Galindo rose while the Huacas were still occupied into the 8th century. This was not one clean fall. What survives is the pattern, and the pattern has not stopped. The same ocean cycle that put water through those temples still runs on the same coast. In 2017, it flooded Trujillo a few kilometers from Huaca de la Luna. The moche response was to seal the ruined temple, cover the painted walls, and build the next one on top of it. 6 times they did that. There is no 7th, and nobody can say whether that is because they finally stopped or because we have not dug deep enough to find it. Number 3. The towns that burned themselves down. Between 2012 and 2014, a team from Durham University dragged magnetometers back and forth across farmland in central Ukraine, near a village called Nebelivka. A magnetometer reads burned clay. Burned clay was exactly what lay under the wheat. What the survey produced was the plan of a settlement covering 238 hectares and containing around 1,445 structures. The houses are laid out in concentric rings with radial streets between them, and at the center there is nothing at all, roughly 65 hectares of empty ground, with unusually large buildings scattered through the plan. The biggest measures 60 meters by 18. A separate program led by Johannes Muller at Kiel University, working with the Ukrainian archaeologist Mikhailo Videyko, mapped Majdanetsky the same way, and found close to 3,000 structures. Talyanki covers over 300 hectares. These are Kukuteni Tripelia settlements built between about 4,100 and 3,400 BC. At their peak, they were the largest human settlements anywhere in Eurasia, and quite possibly on Earth. They predate the first cities of Mesopotamia by centuries. There is no writing, no palace, no obvious royal burial, and no fortification. And every one of them burned. What makes the burning so hard to explain is the arithmetic. At Nebelivka, about 2/3 of the excavated houses had been heated until their clay walls vitrified, which takes temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Between 2014 and 2015, a team led by Stuart Johnston and John Chapman built 2 houses at the site using period methods and burned them down. The 2-story house needed 30 cubic meters of firewood. That is the equivalent of about 420 trees, and roughly 10 times the timber that had gone into building the house in the first place. From ignition to wall, a collapse took under 5 hours. A house does not do that by accident. Somebody hauled 10 times the construction weight of the building in dry wood, packed it inside, and lit it. Now the part that reframes everything. They did not clear the ruins and rebuild on the footprint. The burned houses were left where they stood, and the collapsed daub slumped into low mounds, some still visible on the surface today. That is the opposite of what happens on a Balkan. Tell where a burned house is flattened, and the next one goes straight on top. At Nebelivka, the settlement gradually became half a place to live and half a cemetery of burned houses. People rebuilt beside their ruins rather than over them, and kept the wreckage in view. Nobody knows why. The strongest interpretation on the table is deliberate closure, a way of ending a house's life on purpose when its occupants died or moved on. And John Chapman has argued for exactly that. Accidental fire cannot account for the temperatures. Warfare does not fit either, because there are no defenses, no weapon caches, and no bodies in the destruction layers. Whatever this was, it was done carefully by people who were not under attack. So what does it cost to end a town? At Nebelivka, on the evidence of the experiments, the answer is a forest. 420 trees for one house, and roughly two-thirds of 1,400 houses went that way. Even spread across generations, this was a society pouring an enormous share of its labor and its woodland into destroying its own buildings and then building more. Even the size of these places is contested, and the disagreement is unsettling in its own quiet way. Maximum estimates put 10,000 people or more at the largest sites. Biserka Gajdarska and Chapman argue that only a third to a sixth of the houses stood occupied at any one time, and that Nebelivka may have been a seasonal gathering place rather than a permanent town. The argument is not really about a number. It is about whether these were cities at all. The largest of them stopped being built after about 3,800 BC, and the whole phenomenon was over by around 3,400. Populations dispersed back into smaller settlements, and the Great Rings were never attempted again. 7 centuries of the same extraordinary cycle came to an end. Build a town of 1,000 houses, live in it a few generations, burn it, build again. We can measure the fuel load, the temperature, and the collapse time to the hour. We cannot recover the reason, and nothing dug up since has given us a way back to it. Number 2. Mohenjo-daro. In 1922, an officer of the Archaeological Survey of India named R.D. Banerjee went to Sindh to record a Buddhist stupa. He found the stupa standing on top of something far older and far larger. Underneath it was a Bronze Age city, laid out on a grid, built of standardized fired brick with covered drains running beneath the streets. Mohenjo-daro was occupied from around 2600 to 1900 BC. Its full extent is genuinely uncertain, with published estimates running from 80 hectares to 300, and the excavated fraction is commonly put at about a tenth. We have never identified a palace in it, or a royal burial, or a temple. Everyone agrees it's a temple. Nobody knows what its inhabitants called it either. The modern name is Sindhi, and it means Mound of the Dead. The city was destroyed and rebuilt at least 7 times. Excavators went down more than 40 feet in places, cutting through occupation layer after occupation layer, each one raised on the flattened remains of the one below. You can see that rebuilding without reading a single report. As the street levels rose, the citizens added new courses of brick to the tops of their wells so the mouths would stay level with the pavement. Where the houses around them have since eroded away, some of those wells now stand alone, brick chimneys, several meters tall, every course marking another rebuild. The city grew upward the way a tree grows rings. Whole districts sit on artificial platforms of mud brick. The Citadel Mound rises around 12 meters. On the residential mound, George Dales traced a massive embankment more than 7 meters tall, faced with a fired brick wall 1.5 meters thick and running for over 300 meters. Somebody was lifting an entire city out of reach of something. The problem is, what? Robert Rakes counted around 150 clay deposits through the ruins, the highest of them, some 30 feet above the plain, and proposed in 1965 that tectonic uplift downstream had dammed the Indus and repeatedly ponded it into a lake around the city. Notice what that model actually describes. Not a wall of water, but a slow rise, with plenty of warning. Notice, too, the qualification from Dales Rakes' own collaborator, who reported that some of the supposed flood clays turned out to be degraded mud brick platforms rather than silt. Michael Jansen went further and argued that the classic stratigraphy is unsound, because Marshall and Mackay correlated their layers by height above sea level instead of by digging them. So the rebuilding is observed, and the flooding that supposedly caused it is not secure. That is an uncomfortable place for a famous story to sit. It gets worse for the famous stories. In 1947, Mortimer Wheeler pointed to scattered skeletons at the site and wrote that men, women, and children appeared to have been massacred there, and that on circumstantial evidence, Indra stood accused. George Dales dismantled it in 1964. 9 years of excavation had produced about 37 bodies and fragments across a city of tens of thousands. Not one of them lay inside the citadel, where a last stand would have happened. There was no destruction layer, no burning, and no weapons. Later craniometric work suggests they were squatters burying their dead in a city that had already been given up. But here is where Mohenjo-daro becomes genuinely unsettling. The end, when it came, was not dramatic at all. Work published in 2012 by Liviu Giosin and colleagues showed the great rivers of the region were fed by the monsoon, not by glaciers. And that rainfall declined steadily after about 5,000 years ago, bottoming out around 4,000. Settlement drifted east toward more reliable rain. No invasion, no burning, no final flood. A city that had rebuilt itself 7 times against catastrophe was undone by weather that simply stopped arriving. Everything else is still down there. The script on the seals has never been deciphered, and specialists cannot agree whether it encodes a language at all. Most of the site has never been touched. What has been exposed is being eaten from underneath by salt drawn out of the water table. And unprecedented rain in 2022 stripped away much of the protective layer laid over the brickwork. The mound of the dead is dissolving. The name it had for itself is written on objects we cannot read. And that is a haunting kind of silence for the largest city of its age. Number 1. Jericho. 260 meters below sea level in the Jordan Valley, water comes out of the ground. The spring is called Ayn Sultan. It is flowing still, and it irrigates about 10 square kilometers of desert floor. Beside it stands an oval mound, roughly 6 hectares, across, rising some 21 meters above the plain. That mound is Tel es-Sultan, and every meter of it is what people left behind. Occupation starts around 10,500 BC with Natufian hunter-gatherers camping at the water. By around 8,000 BC, they had built something no one had built before. It is a stone tower, roughly 8.5 meters high and 9 across at the base, with 22 steps cut into a stairway running up through its core. Doral's estimate of the labor quoted by Ofer Bar Yosef comes to somewhere near 10,000 working days. 100 people, 100 days. Around it ran a wall standing over 3.5 meters where it survives, with a rock-cut ditch in front 8 meters wide and nearly 3 deep. Everyone assumes that is a defense. Bar Yosef pointed out that the wall is far thicker on the western uphill side than it is on the north and south. That is not how you fortify against people. It is how you protect against water and mud coming off the hills. The evaluators who assessed Jericho for World Heritage in 2023 recorded the question as open. Then, the site was abandoned. Then, it was reoccupied. Kathleen Kenyon, digging between 1952 and 1958, found what she called a complete stratigraphical break between the two Neolithic settlements. Below it, curved houses and one tool tradition. Above it, rectangular rooms with burnished plaster floors and a different toolkit after a gap of centuries. Different people, same spring. And then it happened again and again. The stratigraphy in Kenyon's deep trench holds 29 distinct phases of habitation from the Neolithic through to the Middle Bronze Age. Within the early Bronze Age alone, she traced 17 successive town walls, each one built because the one before it had failed. Charles Warren sank the first shafts into the mound in 1868. Sellin and Watzinger worked it before the First World War Garstang through the 1930s. And an Italian and Palestinian expedition under Lorenzo Negro has been there since 1997. Every one of them dug through somebody's rebuild. Some of those failures have now been read directly out of the ground. In 2012, a team of seismologists and archaeologists published an archaeoseismic study of the Tell and identified 2 Neolithic earthquakes the earlier somewhere between 7,500 and 7,000 BC and the later around 6,000 BC, separated by undisturbed layers. The evidence is physical and specific. Walls collapsed. Human remains lie underneath fallen building debris. Open fractures 3 to 5 meters long run across floors and through walls, one of them gaping 20 centimeters, all of them trending in the same direction. Sections of wall were shifted as single pieces, and in both cases, the buildings were rebuilt afterwards on identical plans. That is not an accident of geology. Tell Sultan sits inside the Dead Sea, transformed the fault system, marking the boundary between the Arabian and African plates, with a strand called the Nuvame Fault, running along the mound's southeastern edge. The World Heritage Evaluation lists the site as a zone of high seismic hazard. Present tense. The Jordan Valley section of that fault does not rupture on a schedule. Paleoseismic work puts the average interval between surface ruptures at around 80 years in the first millennium of the Common Era and 550 in the second. Nobody can tell you when the next one arrives. Shaking was not the only thing that emptied the place. The current excavators think the spring itself faltered in the Pottery Neolithic and that the tell stood almost deserted while people moved east. It filled again when the water came back. That is the disturbing thread running through the whole sequence. The settlement tracks the water and ignores the ground. One honest correction, because the usual claim overreaches. The mound was not occupied continuously into the present. It was given up after the Iron Age, and Byzantine and modern Jericho grew up 1.5 kilometers east. What has been continuously inhabited for 10,000 years is the oasis, not the hill, which is exactly the point, and it is why this belongs at number 1. The tower is still standing, 22 steps worn smooth running up through the middle of the oldest stone tower in the world. It has long been braced with metal beams, and maintenance work in 2021 recorded fresh cracks in its lintels and flaking on the steps. 11,000 years of people came to that spring, built against the flood, were shaken flat, buried their dead under the rubble, cleared the site, and set the walls back up on exactly the same lines. They knew anyone standing on that mound could see 17 failed walls in the ground beneath their feet. They rebuilt anyway. The alternative was to walk away from the only reliable water for a very long way in any direction. That calculation has never changed. And it is the most extraordinary thing about our species. We do not build where the ground is safe. We build where the water is, and where the harbor is, and where the soil is rich, because a volcano put it there. Then we rebuild on top of ourselves, and we call the accumulated wreckage a city. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.